agenda, I'm going to be holding all other orders before us. I'm sorry? Yeah, call to order the committee of the whole. Thank you. This evening, Legal Affairs is going to consider only order number 30 through 30D, all of which have to do with the proposal to adopt the specialized building code for Beverly. And this evening's presentation will have a full discussion of, Q&A from the council to Dylan Patel, who is from Department of Energy Resources, as well as Arena Keefe, our Sustainability Director, and Jordan Stutt, who's Chair of the Clean Energy Advisory Committee. We have some other folks also from the committee and some other interested members of the public, and I can assure you that this will be a relatively informal, so if any of you have questions, raise your hand, and we'll try to give you a chance to chime in as we go through questions from the councilors as well. So without further ado, do we need to call roll?
Okay.
So I just, do you want to go through and just for the record, see who is here?
Yes. Councilor Hausman.
Here.
Councilor Bowen. Here. Councilor Spang. Here. Councilor Feldman. Here. Councilor Sweeney.
Here.
Councilor St. Hilaire. Here. Councilor Rotundo is not here. Councilor Crowley is not here, and President Flowers is not here, for the record.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie. All right, so without further ado, I know that just a couple of brief comments. So I've asked the presentation that was given to the council, the full council last week, to sort of also be put up as a reference point. So if folks have any questions, it can be used as sort of an illustration of the topic that's under discussion. And I would just say just one preliminary comment, which is I have spoken with Jim Butler, who's the building commissioner for the city of Beverly, as I believe Ms. Keefe has as well. He is, if you will, fine or neutral with this proposal in terms of the administrative adoption of this. He said basically it's business as usual. It's part of what they do as building code matters change. So from sort of that point of view of implementation by the city staff, there's no objection, there's no endorsement per se. His job is simply to implement whatever ordinance is adopted, and he indicated there would be no problem doing that. So without further ado, I would like to turn to members of the subcommittee, I guess Councilor Feldman, if you have any questions, and then we'll go to the council at large in terms of any questions you might have.
I don't have any questions at this time. I think the presentation was pretty thorough and there were some questions asked at the time, so I'm just very much looking forward to kind of hearing more about this, because I think it's a great idea. I'm usually very highly supportive and been asking about a lot of these questions in moving our community forward in building codes and putting things on the books to increase our sustainability and our goals for resiliency, for coastal resiliency, and part of that is, moving towards some of these policies that we would like. So I think it's a win-win, basically, in terms of what we will be getting credit-wise for the city and for our goals for the community in terms of sustainability. So.
Okay, thank you, Councilor. I would also add, if council would find it useful for a quick review of the presentation on the PowerPoint, we could certainly do that, just to sort of help you refresh your memory and generate any questions you might have about it. So I will entertain questions from other members of the council regarding this. Councilor Bowen?
Thank you. So in following this through the Clean Energy Advisory Committee prep work and other communities adopting, one of the things I've been most excited about is sort of how it helps shape the market overall. Because, you know, I think we all know we can't afford not to make this transition eventually. And it can be hard for individual, you know, homeowners, developers, people looking to build, to think about, you know, they're trying to save every dollar, so anything that costs more initially can have a little sticker shock. So it's how we think about that trade-off over time. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the cost savings aspects over time that are anticipated for buildings that meet these new standards. Some of the incentives in place to help make that possible for the first people to start implementing some of these changes, and how that then helps folks down the line by creating the market that brings down costs overall for you know, houses that meet the passive house standard, for example, and for some of the technology that's needed, making heat pumps more accessible, all the different pieces that are gonna play into this, how one more community or 10 more communities adopting the code helps bring down those costs for everybody over the long term and helps smooth any cost increases for people adopting right off the bat.
Yeah, and if I might, whether it's Mr. Patel or Jordan, please come up to the microphone here. I'll try to keep it as informal, and if you're closer up here rather than the podium in the back, I think that's helpful. So.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Bowen. So I'll start off with technology, and a lot of the technological aspects of the specialized code are also present in the current stretch code, and that's due to the fact that under both codes there are similar home energy rating systems for at least single and small multifamily systems. So things like heat pumps, we're seeing wide-scale adoption already under the stretch code. When it comes to your larger multifamily buildings, those that are over 12,000 square feet, those would be required to have passive house standards under the specialized energy code. That's not necessarily a change in technology rather than a change in building construction style. And what we've seen is that I think a lot of builders and architects are apprehensive about it because it is a new way of building. And I think that there are more soft costs involved in terms of getting a good architect, getting a good passive house consultant, different testing that might be required. Having said that, we've seen, at least in the units that have been constructed, both in this state and in New York State, that costs are going down, holding other factors constant, of course. And we're actually seeing a lot more interest in the passive house standard, and that coupled with a wide range of incentives are actually seeing a cost neutral. At the end of the day, the cost per square foot and the total construction cost is actually very comparable to current building costs. In terms of, and then moving back to single family, for all electric houses, the standard of construction is, let's say, a little bit less rigorous, both under the stretch code and the specialized code. And there are vast incentives available from Mass Save. This in turn lowers the construction costs and then your mortgage costs. And so there may be higher operating costs just because the cost of electricity is right now higher than the cost of gas per unit of energy. Again, we don't know what the dynamics are going to be. I think we forecast within DOER that at least on a per MMBTU basis, there will be parity and then some kind of divergence because we're a gas-constrained state. we will be a much more gas-constrained state in the future. And so we hope that even with an all-electric building, the operating costs will be quite a minimal increase. And again, you're saving much more on your mortgage. With a mixed fuel house, it's going to be the opposite, basically. The construction costs are going to be a lot more because you have those two extra requirements. You have the solar panel requirement, not on all houses, only when it's feasible, and then the pre-wiring requirement. Those are two value-added requirements. So your solar is going to save you money on your electric bill, and then the pre-wiring will save someone down the line any cost to retrofit a project for switching out an appliance in the future. This is an added cost right now during the time of construction, which is going to be substantially less than having to do it 10 or 20 years down the line if you're having to rip out a section of the wall and hire an electrician and put new wiring in.
Thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
Dylan covered that quite well, but I'm actually going to refer to a couple of his slides that are very back.
I do have some slides on the actual incentives that are available under Mass Save. I just didn't have them in my head right now.
Okay.
So, yeah, do you want to speak to this one?
So under the Mass, thank you. Under the Mass Save program, which I believe this is the approved, the going to be improved incentives under the new 3-year plan that's rolling out this year. Mass Save will cover quite a bit of the soft costs, so your feasibility studies, your modeling costs. And then there's going to be a pre-certification and a post-certification per unit payout. So that will be about $3,750 per unit. So if you think about a 100-unit apartment, then that's $375,000. And then those are on top of what's available under the 45L federal tax credit program. Again, this is a tax program that has lasted several administrations, I believe. And this provides passive house, I believe, qualifies under zero energy ready, although I'm not certain about that. But what I am certain about is that under the LIHTC program, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit program, more points are awarded for passive house projects. And this, I guess this feeds into the affordability aspect of it. We have a lot of passive house buildings, multifamily buildings being built across the state. 1/3 of them that are being certified will be mixed unit apartments. And a lot of them will be eligible for the LIHTC credit.
Thanks. And just one more note, another great slide from Dylan's deck here just shows the currently built and projected future build of passive house in the state. So Councilor Bowen, to your question about what this means for the market as we continue to scale this up, we're going to see more and more builders that get pretty comfortable building to this standard. It'll be easier to find them, and you won't see that soft cost adder in the near term.
I will add, sorry, one last thing. So I'll add that based on conversations I've had with the Deputy Director of Energy Efficiency at DOER, this is 2023 data. From what he's heard, that there are actually now closer to 20,000 units in queue, at least, that are waiting to become passive house certified, but, at various stages of construction or permitting.
All right, thank you. Councilor Feldman, do you want to follow up with a question?
Through you, I had a quick question about, you mentioned a gas constraint state. Is that when the supply exceeds, the demand exceeds the supply for gas in the state? In terms of energy production?
So the state of Massachusetts has very limited gas infrastructure.
Right.
We're a gas-constrained state in that in certain places, it's very difficult for either National Grid or Eversource to put in new gas service lines, for example, a new subdivision. We mostly get our natural gas from the LNG terminal in Everett. And I don't think there are very, very many developed plans for pipelines. And if there are, I think there's a lot of grassroots opposition for it. This creates a lot of supply constraint, and we've seen that after the invasion of Ukraine. And it has I wouldn't say I wouldn't characterize it as supply has, or demand has exceeded supply. It's just that whenever demand gets too high or supply gets too low, we do see those price strikes.
So would this, I guess, is what I'm saying in terms of market, this type of code, this type of energy code would actually have an offset effect of bringing down the cost of energy for natural gas, wouldn't it then? If we were taking the burden off of that system in terms of constraints, wouldn't that have less market demand for natural gas, and therefore those that were dependent on it drive down their energy costs as well?
You have two opposing dynamics going on here. So you're correct that under the specialized code, there is a incentive to build all electric or at least minimize gas use. But we're minimizing the marginal increase in demand. It's not that demand is going to go down, it's just that it's not going to go up as much. At the same time that supply is quite fixed. Supply is very unlikely to go up. I'll also add that, as we move away from gas, because of the economics of gas, there are fixed infrastructure investments that National Grid and Eversource have to recoup. And based on our current rate structure that the DPU sets, there's like a perverse effect going on that even if gas usage does go down, gas costs go up because you're spreading the same costs over fewer and fewer people.
Okay.
And we can get into the future of gas and all that, but I think that's a separate topic.
Just curious. Okay.
Yes,
Thanks.
of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few comments sprinkled in with some questions, if that's all right, just a couple minutes. I just wanted to start by thanking the Clean Energy Advisory Committee. I think this is exactly the type of proposal you should be bringing to us, and it's very professionally done, and I appreciate your work in being engaged in that. With that said, I think, it's our duty to look at this and see what the impacts are, what are the benefits, and evaluate whether it makes sense. And I took note of a comment Mr. Chairman Strout made at the public hearing last week that, sort of got to my question around housing affordability. And he suggested that this might not be a direct quote, but that this isn't in conflict with housing affordability, but rather this proposal is in service to promoting more housing affordability. And I found that statement a little curious and did some research and found that there's a lot of perspectives on this, in that perspective may not be unanimous in looking at and talking to developers both locally in my network across the state. I found that there's a strong feeling that this will absolutely increase upfront costs and that will absolutely impact housing affordability. And so I guess just kind of curious if developers have been part of this conversation, if that's feedback that you've received, and sort of what your response is to that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's the most important issue here is the affordability one. Yeah. My comments were based on two elements. One, what we've actually seen in the marketplace and the cost of which those buildings have been built that conform to the passive house standard, which in Massachusetts has been just over 2%. That's the average so far prior to the incentives. So that strikes me as a reasonable range. But then the other piece of it is the dramatic reduction in energy usage in those buildings, which I think is critically important to low and moderate income folks that are paying a disproportionately high share of income on energy bills.
So again, I think there is a different perspective from the development community, at least the ones that I've spoken with, and would love to maybe try to invite more of that feedback. You know, they cite difficult regulations already and onerous regulations that make it difficult to get projects done already. And adding another 2% may not sound like a big amount, but that could be the difference between a project being done here or being done somewhere else, right? And so, you know, I do think we need to consider that, and was also curious whether this is something the mayor supports. Do we know that?
I think we can ask Ms. Keith that. Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Ms. Keith, would you like to respond to Counselor? Good evening.
Hi, good evening. I promise I'm not hiding from you in the corner there.
No, that's okay.
Right behind the lectern. So yes, the mayor is generally supportive. We've been, learning along the way with everyone here through this process, and we've had several conversations with Dylan and his team at DOER. The mayor did just have a meeting with Commissioner Mahoney, the Department of Energy Resources, to kind of pepper in some more questions around development impact. So, I think we're hearing some of the same conflicts and know that this, part of it is growing pains, right? Part of it is learning how to design to that new passive house standard, which is a pretty new model for folks. I do have on my notebook, just for reference, a sense of the number of developments that we've had multifamily in Beverly over the last year. So let me just grab that and share.
Thank you. Yeah, while we're waiting for Ms. Keefe, I would just comment, Counselor, that anytime you adopt something new, there's going to be a learning curve. Sure. And associated with that learning curve, there's going to be an incremental difference in cost, marginal cost difference. So I guess you can just take that as, do we, as a community, are we forward-thinking, or are we, or do we want to lag the curve? And I think the question about affordability is right on target. It's part of our job to sort of figure that out. And obviously, we're going to have perhaps a multitude of points of view on that question. So,
If I may just follow up on that,
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
I think what's a marginal increase to you might be a cost prohibitive increase to somebody else. And so I think we need to be sensitive to that. And I would also say, the 48 communities that have adopted this has been touted as a big show of support. That's 13% of our communities, right? There's 351 cities and towns. And, when looking at the list, it's a lot of the very wealthier communities, the Newtons, the Brooklines, the Somervilles, the Cambridges. Salem in our area is really the only one in Swampscott. You look at Danvers, Peabody, Wenham, Hamilton, Manchester, Gloucester, Topsfield, Middleton, Rockport, Essex, none of them have done this. So why not see how this goes in other communities? Why put our community at a disadvantage in terms of, additional financial burdens? That's kind of my thoughts on this. I don't know that I am eager to support something that's going to increase the upfront cost of building housing in Beverly. I'm just not sure, so.
yeah. I want to go to first Ms. Keefe, Mr. Strutt, and then Counselor Feldman, and I'll get back to you. I'm sorry. Well, I'll jump in here. Go ahead.
So I think you've already heard the point around the cost to the tenant versus the cost to the developer. So it seems more, reasonable and rational that we can conclude that if you are living in one of these units that has a really tight envelope, that your operating costs, your bills, monthly bills are going to be, in better shape than if you're in a really leaky building. So for just developments, just to report on what has been approved. So we've seen in the presentation from last week the cost impact for a small and a large single-family development. We approved 8 of those last year and permitted 4 and had 9 occupied in the calendar year 2024. So that's the order of magnitude that we're talking for just this past year. And then for multifamily developments, we had 6 in 2024 approved, 2 permitted, and 1 development occupied. We can report on the units, but those are the more larger scale developers that are trying to build those projects to passive house standard.
Mr. Strutt, you wanted to add, and then I'll go to Counselor Feldman, and then.
Yeah, just one more note on the point about affordable housing and the ability to continue building. While not for comparisons to Beverly, the 2 biggest cities in New England, and Worcester and Boston, have both adopted this code, and they're building a whole lot more affordable housing than we are. So I think there are going to be a lot of lessons to be learned from what's happening in those communities.
For sure. Thank you.
Counselor Feldman?
To some of those, the Counselor St. Hilaire's points on affordable housing, like the 2% cost to a developer is a lot less marginally than the cost of heating your home or cooling your home for somebody of a lower income. So I don't find, and frankly, developers aren't our constituents. Our constituents are the people that live in the buildings, so that's who we're representing, not developers. And I take umbrage with the fact that we're so, well, we don't want to build more buildings, we don't want to build more housing, and then, but now we're talking about, will that prevent developers from building in Beverly? So I just feel like it's kind of talking out of both sides of our mouth if we're going to talk about, well, if we put these developers, you know, if we make it harder for them to build in Beverly, then they won't build in Beverly. But for like 3 years on council, there's been people that have been saying, we don't want more building in Beverly. So I don't understand why we wouldn't be supportive of something that would prohibit building in Beverly. I find it slightly hypocritical, so.
Councilor St. Hilaire, and then I
mean, I would just,
I want to jump back to
suggest that rather than someone suggesting that we shouldn't be developing in Beverly, it was more of a motive around finding some balance around development in Beverly, which was supported by the council. And that's not what, you know, to me, doesn't make sense to say no development. I mean, we have to have development. I don't think anyone's suggesting that.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Spang.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
I wanted to switch a little bit to talk about the benefits, and I think it was the slide, page 9 from the original slides, went through what can be expected for climate leaders, and I just had a question because it looked like it said, yes, this one. So the $1 million in capital funding, is that, I know there was another slide that said that Beverly over the last 10 years has been a green community and has gotten about 1.3 million in DOR incentives.
Yeah, that's correct.
So that was over 10 years. So then this $1 million under capital funding, is this like once you're a climate leader, you're eligible for the whole million, or is it also like an overtime thing?
So we've been discussing this internally today. It's a one-time $1 million grant for the 3-year cycle that we have. I cannot tell you what is going to happen after the 3 years because we do not know. So you won't have to apply for the, you will not need to apply for that $1 million in phases. You can apply for as much up to $1 million, depending on the project. It's like a one-time grant.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up
Yes,
question,
please.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, please.
And I don't know if this would be for you or for someone else from the CEAC, but looking at a lot of the things that it could qualify for, I'm just wondering, like, does Beverly have a plan for maximizing that money if we were to become a clean climate leader? Because I know we already have a lot of solar arrays and have done some work on sustainability in some of these areas. So do we know as a city if we have a way to spend it?
Ms. Keefe?
So this is a brand-new grant program, so it hasn't even been, the details, I think, haven't even been determined or decided. The notice of opportunity is going to be issued in, correctly, summer, early summer?
It has been posted.
Oh, there we go.
And we will be hosting a webinar on it on Thursday, but obviously the projects can vary from city to city.
So if you support the specialized code now, then we may be eligible for the grant funding in an application later in the summer, early fall. The notification would come in January, February. So since this, the opportunity here is that unlike the Green Communities funding, the Climate Leaders supports new construction as well as existing buildings and retrofits. So it's not just energy efficiency work. So, when we think about, yes, we have lots of solar, but when we think about heat pumps, there's a lot of our buildings that when we're looking to electrify, we're probably going to go in the direction of heat pumps. And that adds up. So it would be part of the capital stack for any capital buildings that are like retrofit projects or new construction that we would consider this grant for.
Okay.
If I may interject while you're there, the recipient of these funds is the municipality?
Yes.
Is that right? And the municipality can choose if you will, a portfolio of, or a banquet of ways in which to apply, but those are still being worked out in specifics, if I heard you correctly?
Yes, and can I also similarly ask, so can you split the, up to $1 million grant across multiple projects, or you're applying for one project at a time?
So that is, I believe it's one project at a time. But I have to double check on that. But the idea is that we require either through utility support or through internal work or through our technical assistance for the city that's applying to be a climate leader to develop a portfolio of projects that they wish to decarbonize by 2050 with a projected timeline as well as an understanding of the condition of those buildings, so that at least in the short term we have an idea of which projects that will be prioritized. So this is a bucket of money that is available, but we will be helping you to figure out which buildings you want to target first.
Okay, thank you.
Adding on to that.
Yes.
So that is one of the climate leaders' criteria called the decarbonization pathways that you need for eligibility in the program. And our approach and kind of our plan to meeting that requirement is to go through the National Grid offering. It's called a portfolio prioritization plan. And it's more of a desktop analysis, but they do send engineers on site to some buildings to look at major systems. So they'd be going into the boiler room, getting a sense of how old the equipment is, what model, and making suggestions around what to replace the equipment with, getting a better handle on end of life. So that is a requirement of DOER for climate leaders. And the work of Eric Barber in our engineering department in setting up an asset management plan means we've already done a lot of that inventory for our school facilities. And this would tack on the rest of the municipal buildings and hopefully nest in well with our asset management planning.
Thank you. Councilor Spain?
Yep, thanks. That goes right into my next question, which was the first slide in the supplemental. I think there's another section and then supplemental, and it's the first slide for that. It has a teddy bear on it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, this one. So this one, and then maybe after it a little bit too, but so this is talking about, I think, what the specialized code will require for any school municipal buildings. Is that just for new buildings also?
So this applies to, so Teddy is similar to the home energy rating system, but it applies to the commercial aspect of both the stretch and the specialized code. So schools are already under the provisions of Teddy.
Okay, under the stretch code.
Under the stretch code. So I think I had a pathway somewhere here. Yes. So this would be what the pathways are for commercial building types and municipal buildings, including offices, schools, etc. So there's the all-electric pathway, which basically follows the stretch code. And this is actually very similar to what we have for the multifamily. So you can go passive house if you mix fuel and have electrification, or you could be totally mixed fuel, conform to Teddy requirements or ASHRAE requirements, and have the electrification and on-site solar where feasible.
If I may just interject, Beverly presently has the stretch code,
Correct.
correct? Or, which was applicable to all new buildings.
Correct.
And I think the stretch code also applies to if you're gonna renovate, right?
The stretch code has provisions for additions and renovations. They differ among the residential and the commercial portions of it, but the specialized code does not. At least not any extra requirements.
And then can I have
Go
one
ahead.
more?
Yes,
My
please.
last question is about ADUs, which I think is maybe around this somewhere. There it is. So if someone is going to, so we did pass an ADU in Beverly, and then I know the state is working on theirs as well. And then if someone wants to build an ADU, it sounds like if they are building it as a standalone on their property, then the specialized code would apply because it's a new structure. And if they're doing it renovating their house or something like that, then maybe it doesn't apply, but the stretch code applies either way.
So
Construction
that is my understanding, and that is not something that we decided on under the energy code. This is something as how the international, residential code, I think it's the IRC. I think that's how they define like whether an ADU is its own building, is whether it's physically attached or not. And therefore the relevant code would apply in whichever case.
And so if someone does want to build a standalone ADU, now if Beverly adopted the specialized code, it would either have to be all electric or meet the same requirements for other houses under 4,000 square feet.
So realistically, it can be all electric. If it's going to be mixed fuel, then it realistically just needs to have the pre-wiring, because an ADU would not have a roof space that's large enough to support solar.
Okay, that's what I was trying to figure out, is how it would impact someone who maybe wants to put in an ADU.
Yeah, so the solar requirement requires at least 300 square foot
Okay.
of not completely sunlit, but mostly sunlit space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Counselor Sweeney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a series of questions here. I'll try to take them in an order that I think makes sense logically. So to start, I want to focus on single-family homes primarily with some of my questions here. So to confirm, single-family houses under 4,000 square feet are not exempt from these standards if the city were to adopt them, but there is additional flexibility in that there are 3 pathways towards compliance other than 2 for single-family homes above 4,000 square feet. That's the difference in that number, correct?
So that's correct, Councillor. So for houses that are less than, actually, let me go to your own. For houses that are less than 4,000 square feet, they can achieve the HERS rating if they're all electric. So that's the same as the stretch code. They can be passive house. But if they're mixed fuel, they have to achieve a slightly more stringent HERS requirement, which is the same as the stretch code, and have the solar PV and wiring for electrification. If they are over 4,000 square feet, then they have to be a net zero house. So they either have to be have the solar PV to enough solar PV to meet the electrical requirements for that, or they have to achieve a slightly higher standard of passive house.
Okay, thank you for that. So sticking with the passive house topic, then I think this will be a helpful slide for my next few questions here. So on an earlier slide, we don't have to jump to it, the 2.3% figure is referenced as the difference in the cost of building a multifamily building that complies with passive house standards. Is that the same metric that we should be utilizing when thinking about the increased cost of constructing a single-family house? And particularly what I'm focused on, these smaller, under 4,000 square foot single-family homes.
No, the reason being is that the figures that we have for multifamily housing are based on empirical data. So that's based on real-world data of, I believe, 11 buildings across the state that averaged between, that range between 1 and 4% with an average of 2.3 before incentives. The DOER cost study that I believe is a supplement to this slide deck is modeled data. And so there's going to be some assumptions on there, and it does not really compare with any kind of base model. So I can't give you like a cost increment. I can only give you like the absolute cost increase.
I think so what would that be? I guess really what I'm concerned about is that we would be flying somewhat blind in terms of the impact to building, the cost of building new single-family housing, particularly single-family housing under 4,000 square feet.
So what we modeled was the average cost increase for the pre-wiring requirement would be around $4,000.
Yeah, I think we talked about this.
And again, that's going to vary depending on how many appliances you have to pre-wire for. And then I believe we modeled a 4 kilowatt system, which was $12,000 gross. And then I think if you're going to net it out, both the feds and the state take away like a third of the cost. So it nets out to about 8,000.
Okay, that's pretty consistent with what we talked about last week. I had the $4,000 figure in my notes. So just so I would understand, in terms of the real cost increases, if a house, a single-family home under 4,000 square feet were to be built, it's not a fully electric home and therefore would need to comply with the wiring
and the solar,
standards.
yep.
That's a $4,000 cost. And then for the solar, the actual cost to install compliant solar panels would be $12,000. There's a 30% federal tax credit. I saw a 15% state credit.
Up to
And
1,000,
then-
I believe, yeah.
Okay. And other than that, there may be other incentives, but those
There-
aren't factored into this cost calculation here?
They're not going to be, so they're not factored into the construction cost. So that's correct. So that's in the most simple terms. So you're netting out at 8 plus 4, which is 12,000. If we want to be talking about the ongoing costs, so you'll have the net metering credits. So those are based on a higher level value of what you would actually pay for with National Grid. And then also the smart credits, which is kind of like a top up on that. That really depends on how much you're generating, so I can't really.
So the hope there is if a third of $12,000 is offset through credits.
Yep.
Whoever's building the single-family house is gonna pay at least $8,000 more to meet these standards. But the hope would be that the single-family home, which now has solar panels on its roof, the owner is generating net metering credits at a delta great enough to offset whatever they would otherwise be paying for electricity over some amount of course of time to offset that $8,000.
That's correct, Councillor Sweeney. I can offer some anecdotal evidence based on like previous meetings that I've had, based on some testimony who've had solar. The payback is between 5 and 10 years. Most people kind of average 7 or 8 years on the payback that they get.
Okay. Okay, that's good to know, thank you. So sticking with the solar requirement, any single-family house that is not all electric must install solar panels, correct?
Not any. So there are exemptions.
Okay,
As I mentioned to Councillor Spang, the actual suitable area of the roof has to be large enough.
and do you think, because I know that in the context of that comment, it was talking about ADUs, which are smaller
They're
units.
pretty small, yeah.
You mentioned a 300-foot figure, I think, of whatever the qualifying, in an area where it would
It has-
actually generate
yes,
a reasonable
so-
amount of energy?
It has to be unobstructed from the sun for 70% of daylight hours.
Okay. I mean, just knowing some of the houses in Beverly, 1,500 square foot or 2,000 square foot home, more often than not, do you think that would meet the standard required to necessitate solar panel installation?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now.
Okay,
I think it is going to depend a lot on the orientation of it and whether it's,
okay,
and also whether it's obstructed, because if it's a new build on a fairly wooded area, then it's going to be shaded. If it's a new build on an open space, then it's much more likely to require solar.
okay.
It really depends on the site specifics.
All right, that makes sense. That's good to know. So continuing on with some questions tied to that slide we were talking about earlier. The $4,000 pre-wiring cost, is that the same as requiring mandatory EV charging infrastructure? I want to make sure I'm not misinterpreting.
No, Councillor, because that's actually already required under the stretch code.
Under the current stretch code.
Under the current stretch code.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. Thank you for that.
So just to elaborate, that pre-wiring requirement is just a few quotes we got of an electrician just putting in some wiring from the circuit to where the gas appliance just happens to be. So in the kitchen where the stove is, in the appliance room where the washer dryer is, et cetera.
And that's really for the internal use of trying to convert a house to some level of fossil fuel to heat. keep
Exactly,
appliances
and
electric at some point.
correct, and if necessary, like a panel upgrade.
Okay, that's helpful to know, thank you. So I do have a few more questions, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for the length here. I want to talk a little bit more about the order, and you may actually be best suited to answer these, Mr. Chairman. But in the proposal before us, there are a handful of definitions. One of the definitions is the International Energy Conservation Code, IECC. And there's a few sections that kind of reference each other in this order. So there's the Specialized Energy Code definition, and it references amendments to the respective net zero appendices of the IECC. And then the IECC definition mentions that it's updated on a 3-year cycle. If we were to adopt this, are we committing ourselves to automatically accepting those updates to the IECC standards every 3 years without actually requiring action taken by this council to update the ordinance if perhaps the amendments to the standards didn't fit with what we thought was best for Beverly and for our specific building code?
So I'm going to make a comment and then ask Mr. Patel to jump in. So just to clarify, I'm not a technical expert on these matters, right? We're all learning. The order, which is the actual, this would be Order 30B, which is the adoption, would be the technical order that we would adopt, has been reviewed and by Solicitor Williams to make sure that it complies with DOER requirements for adoption. So the important thing I want to let you know is that this is in final form as vetted by the administration in the solicitor's office for adoption. The question about whether we would automatically, if there are changes to the international code, be required to follow them as incorporated into these changes, I'm going to ask Mr. Patel to answer.
The short answer is yes. You adopt it as is. Any changes that are made to the specialized code are automatic across all of the adoptees across the state. There are two things I want to add to that, is that it takes a council vote to opt into the code, it takes a council vote to opt out of it. So if it doesn't fit with Beverly, then it's within all of your power to vote out of it. The second thing I want to add is that you already do have a code that is adopted, that is updated automatically every 3 years that the council follows, and that is the stretch code.
And that's tied
follows.
to the same standard, the International Energy Conservation Code?
That is correct. Okay. So the stretch code essentially exists as, within the state of Massachusetts, it's 225 CMR appendices 23 and 24. Those follow the IECC standard, the International Energy Conservation Code of 2021. So 225 CMR 22 and 23 get updated as the IECC gets updated. The specialized code is just literally just attaching two appendices to that. Appendices RC and CC. So any changes that are made to the IECC are made to the stretch code and therefore to the specialized code.
Okay, that's helpful.
And I'd actually like to add a couple of comments to that. One is that in talking with Solicitor Williams about this is sort of you adopt all of it or you adopt none of it. So it's not as though we can sort of opt out of certain portions of it and keep other portions of it. The other comment I would make is just sort of revisit my conversation with our building commissioner in terms of adoption. I asked him, would this be burdensome? How would this impact your office? And basically he said, business as usual. This is our job. These improvements come down the pike, sort of in the ordinary course. It's not that it wouldn't make, his job would certainly be easier if he never had to learn something new. But in terms of adopting the specialized energy code, he said, everyone, there are builders out there still learning the stretch code, for example. So everyone is in a learning curve process of this, but from his point of view, administratively, not a big deal, I guess is how I would characterize it. So anyway.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
I do have some more questions.
Go ahead.
I apologize. These are more so tied to the benefit that Beverly would see and kind of the larger goal that we're looking to achieve here. So are there any estimates, something quantifiable to project what the impact of Beverly's adoption of this specialized stretch code would have on reducing carbon emissions by 2050? And maybe to rephrase this, is there a way to project out what the difference would be between us continuing along with our current stretch code and some of our sustainability goals around future development and transit-oriented housing and whatnot, kind of maintaining the status quo versus adopting this? What do we gain in terms of estimated reduction in carbon emissions?
So we estimate across the state that, and I think I kind of skipped over this last week, that by 2050, about a quarter of our housing stock will be new builds. So we can make a reasonable assumption that by developing this specialized stretch code, which is a net zero code, that at the very least, that percentage of the housing stock will be zero carbon. That's assuming that all of the construction will take place in municipalities that have adopted the specialized code. But to give a quantifiable answer, I'm sorry, Councillor, I can't do that because it really depends on how much the city of Beverly is going to be building between now and 2050.
So maybe, I appreciate that response, and maybe I'll phrase it to you, Mr. Stutt, and some of the work that the Clean Energy Advisory Committee did. Are there anything that you can point to in particular when looking at some of the newer development on Rantoul Street that would be improved in terms of energy efficiency, reduced carbon emissions, things that the adoption of this ordinance would really prompt, given that it would be pretty heavy-handed standards for larger new development, as opposed to the current stretch code, which, to my understanding, much of the new development in Beverly is more energy efficient than perhaps it had been 15, 20 years ago before that. So really, when you think about the bigger development, what do we gain from this that we wouldn't otherwise gain?
Do you want to go? I have a comment, but
Okay.
Yeah, so thinking about the most recent development in Beverly, looking at the multifamily housing, we haven't had a chance to go through and look at the projected emissions from each of those buildings and compare them to the expected emissions had they been built to passive house standard. So don't have a quantifiable answer for you on that yet, but that seems like something that we can take a little time to dig into.
That would certainly be helpful if it could be pulled together
I
before
don't
we
want to
vote.
overpromise on the quality of the data there, but yeah, we'll look into it.
Okay.
But really, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about major investments in infrastructure that will be here for well beyond 2050 if it's built sufficiently. There aren't that many opportunities then to go back and revisit that without spending a whole lot more money to reduce emissions from those buildings. So this is a long-term investment, and every time we build something that's going to be around for 30, 40 years, that removes an opportunity for us to reduce our emissions. So that goal becomes harder and harder to achieve. So that's why we see this as a really critical opportunity to do this, to make sure that future development is up to this standard, which I would say is not a huge leap beyond what is already a fairly stringent stretch code, and folks are obviously able to build to that code. But it does embrace some new technology and hopefully will deliver some savings along the way.
Okay, and thank you for that. I guess what I'd really like to understand in thinking about why we do this is if there is a way to quantify the reduction in presumably the goal is to reduce carbon emissions in new buildings in Beverly, to work towards some of our targets about reducing emissions as a way for Beverly to play its part in combating climate change.
One of the many goals,
Kind of
but
like
yes.
the high-level goal of putting this policy forward. And so I guess my concern is that if the difference between the specialized stretch code and the existing stretch code isn't enough in terms of trying to quantify carbon emission reductions to warrant taking a more heavy-handed approach in putting these mandates in place for future construction, my concern would be that we would end up in a scenario where some of these houses that are under 4,000 square feet that I would like to see Beverly build more of, particularly more single-family housing if we can, but really that kind of like smaller 2 to 3 family multifamily housing that Beverly so desperately needs. My concern would be that while taking an action that is certainly well-intentioned in adopting the specialized stretch code, we would inadvertently be making the construction of those 2 or 3 family, small multifamily units cost enough of a difference more to disincentivize whoever's building them from building them, or build them, but they're put on the market at a price point that isn't really affordable for the folks that we would hope to target with the creation of this housing and bringing that online. And then on the flip side, that we wouldn't actually be reducing carbon emissions that much more because some of the newer buildings that are coming on, especially the larger buildings that are compliant with our current stretch code, are close to net zero in terms of emissions. I don't know what those buildings that have recently been built, where they kind of fit in terms of the carbon emissions coming from those buildings and where they would be if they were to comply with the standard. And I think that's, if possible, to quantify that, that to me is really going to be a big part of the calculation of whether or not I see it as something that is beneficial to meet our overall climate goals, or is something that's well-intentioned but would actually hurt housing affordability and the development of some of this missing middle housing that I think Beverly desperately needs. So that's, to put into context, that's kind of where I'm coming from with a lot of these questions.
Yeah, and I think those are good questions. To the first point, the carbon reductions from this new building type of multifamily housing, I think is really important. I think that's one of many reasons that we've discussed within our committee and within this council of why we're pushing this forward. I think, I don't think it's really fair to call the additions in the energy code, in the specialized energy code, heavy-handed, but then to discount the emission reductions that would come from them. But we can provide some additional quantification there on the emissions delta. But when it comes to the affordability of building new small housing, single-family homes, as discussed, we're looking at a price premium of about $12K.
Yep.
I don't know the number off the top of my head about what the median price of a new small single-family home is in Beverly. My guess is that adding that price premium on top of that cost to build in the sale of that house, especially when you factor in the fact that the new owners or tenants are going to have lower energy bills, I don't think that that's going to be enough to dramatically hurt development of that type of housing. That's just my somewhat uninformed estimate, but I think.
No, I appreciate that input. Thank you, Mr. Stott.
May I add some comments to that?
Yes, and then I want to chime in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm done with questions after that one, so
Okay.
we can move. That was it for me, yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah, so thank you, Councillor. So 2 comments on that. I think the biggest delta that you're going to see are on the multifamily housing. The reason being is that the current stretch code is arguably quite stringent. I think on an energy basis, but less so. There is under the stretch code, I think the requirements that we have for multifamily housing do require some minimization of energy use, but it does not go nearly as far as the passive house standards. What we've been able to see and quantify is that heating loads and overall energy use can be reduced by 50-60%, as seen on the slides, compared to traditional building types. And by traditional, I think that this is probably comparing the previous stretch code, so the one that was before the latest update, but not completely certain on that. Having said that, the passive house building style uses such little energy that your carbon impact is basically zero. It is as close to a net zero style of construction as there is. The current stretch code does not do that. The second, to your second point, which I definitely sympathize as someone who's on the housing market, the issue of missing middle housing, which just as an aside, I think is more of a zoning issue than an energy code issue. But I think the carbon delta on that, I think, is going to be quite high. The reason being is that the current stretch code, yes, it does go a little bit more stringent than an all-electric house. You have to go House 42 versus House 45. But the idea of having, solar PV helps to kind of offset the kind of extra carbon emissions that are being produced by those fossil fuel emissions. So the specialized code is intended to be a net zero code, while the stretch code is just meant to maximize energy efficiency, which are related but separate things. The final point is that by having these extra requirements on the specialized code, we're hoping to see much more electric buildings versus natural gas buildings, which, as I just mentioned, even though are harder on the stretch code, it's not as hard. And so by having much more electric buildings, we're able to take advantage of the fact that the grid is going to be much cleaner by 2050. So it just makes less sense from a carbon perspective to be building a mixed fuel home, a home with natural gas. And I think the way to do that is through the specialized stretch code.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and I want to thank you both. I asked you a lot of questions, you provided a lot of very good information, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to chime in, and then Councilor Feldman, I know, wants to be heard as well. So listening to the overall conversation, trying to step back a little bit, a few things come to mind. One is to the issue of the additional cost to developers and sort of the knock-on effect to homeowners, young people. I have children who would like to buy a house as well, and they're in the same kind of boat that you are in. My perspective, I guess, is that many of the young people who want to buy those houses want and would be looking for and maybe even expecting housing that helps us meet the kinds of standards, like a net zero standard, because their time frame is not, today's builder who's looking at a marginal 2% additional in cost. They're looking at what their children and what they in their older years will be looking at in terms of the climate. Because remember what we're trying to do here, and that is not impose costs for the heck of it. We are trying to meet an actual challenge, a challenge that Governor Baker, who I know both two of my fellow councilors here worked for, foresaw and set this whole process in motion in terms of the climate legislation that he led and tried to pass. And I don't think his concerns were primarily the marginal cost for a developer. They were really like, what's going on with the climate? And what can we do as leaders in this Commonwealth to try to address those challenges? And that's why, in particular, in the resolution, which was a team effort, and I want to give credit to, sort of the team effort that worked on this resolution. I won't try to name names because I'll inevitably miss some, but it was a team effort. One of the things that I, in my writing, and I know Councilor Bowen, I guess I will name one name, but to give credit where credit is due, helped out in this a little bit, is the phrase that future generations will rightly hold us to account for what we do, and I added, for what we do not do, because this is really a challenge for all of us, for the children in Beverly today who will be adults in 10, 20, 30 years, and the kind of world that they live in. And so it's not just, well, we've done the stretch code, let's rest on our laurels. It's what do we not do that we can seize the opportunity to do that's important. I mean, I think all of the questions that are being asked here about affordability and balancing, like Councilor St. Hilaire is mentioning, and affordability questions are all right on the money. They're the right questions for us to be asking. But I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the bigger picture, which is why are we doing this? Just a couple of other more specific comments. One is, in terms of the impact on our residents, we should remember that the $1 million grant and technical assistance of $150 million is a direct payoff to our constituents in tax relief. And it maybe $1 million doesn't seem like that much of a tax relief, but I think every little bit helps in terms of giving a tax break directly, or in this case, indirectly, to Beverly residents. The last thing I want to say is we have before the planning board a development, and I'm not going to try to nail the number, but something like 450 units of development up on Apple Village, that neck of the woods. I think it's important for us to have, in effect, if we adopt this, which I hope we do, to have this in effect in a way that applies to those units. That is a huge amount of new housing in Beverly that I hope we'll have the foresight to see really can be both subject to this and also the residents getting the benefit of the implementation that would come from this. So in that regard, I'm going to ask a very detailed question with Mr. Patel, which is, in the ordinance, I provided I think a 6-month period before this would take effect once the council, if it does adopt it, adopts it. I know DOER actually prefers an either January 1st or July 1st adoption or effective date on adoption. And I gather from our conversation that really has to do with if changes take place down the road to the code, that DOER would like to see all of the cities in Commonwealth sort of be in sync with those changes rather than sort of one-off adoption dates throughout the Commonwealth. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct, Councillor. So the DOER highly recommends having a July 1st or January 1st effective date. That way it aligns with any, if any, changes to the regular stretch code, because those take place during those times. So it just makes sense for developers for it to align in that case. In the history of the stretch code being available, there have been only one municipality out of the 300 or so adoptees of the stretch code that have done it on an off cycle. So it's just really, it helps the developers just that bit more if there is alignment on July 1st or January 1st. The second question is whether on the 6-month waiting period. So that is something that we also recommend just to give the building inspector and for builders and developers a transition time. And so it will be the closest January or July from the 6 months following. Having said that, there have been cases, I think both Salem and Swampscott had adopted it within 5 months. So the city council or the select board in both cases voted in February. I guess for Swampscott it was town meeting. They voted in February to be effective in July.
Okay, so for colleagues who are here, probably what I would do is offer an amendment to change the adoption date to be in sync with that July 1st as opposed to a 6 months from whenever we vote if we end up adopting it. So Councilor Feldman, you were next, and then Councilor St. Hilaire.
Yeah, just a brief comment. First, what you were, Councilor Houseman, what you were saying about what the generations will demand in terms of buying and looking at single-family homes. I just personally went through this with our own home and choices we had to make in terms of our detached garage does not have electrical conduit. We didn't have an electric car at the time, but we were redoing yard work, and it would have required ripping up all of the backyard a second time to lay conduit to the backyard. And so we made the choice preventatively, because we knew nobody was going to want to buy a house in 10 years that didn't have an electric car hookup in the backyard. So we're already making those types of choices without those types of codes. So I think the market is starting to your point, I think the market is demanding those preventative measures in the houses that are going to be setting them up for future sustainability and success for those households. So that's personal experience. But I was also thinking about at a more high level in terms of our jobs as elected officials and representing our constituents in terms of getting ahead of trends and what we're looking forward in the future. And I have to say that watching what's going on in the news right now in terms of where Beverly is positioned with the inclusionary zoning debacle that's going on, I am so proud that Beverly and our elected officials had the foresight to have something like that in place. And we are now being rewarded for that because it's costing these communities that are playing catch up thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of working on these things, first of all, under duress if they're going to comply, and then having to fight legal battles that they're going to keep losing. And we're really sitting pretty in terms of that because we were ahead of it. So I would never want to make a choice as a counselor because other communities haven't done it yet. I would rather be on the beginning end of a curve or a market trend that's shifting towards benefiting our constituents long-term than be playing catch-up and making these decisions under duress. And I feel like anything that has to do with sustainability and green building is absolutely trending in this direction anyway. So I just feel like it's our job to be ahead of those things for our constituents, to not end up in the place where we're playing catch up and then costing them more money in the long run. So that's my high level feelings on just why we would make decisions like this without other communities necessarily adopting it sooner.
Councilor St. Hilaire and then Councilor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be quick. So I think we would all probably acknowledge that Beverly's been a leader in climate change, and I think on a national level, Massachusetts has also been a leader. I think it's notable that we have not adopted this, the Mass legislature has not adopted this statewide. That to me is a further indication that this is not exactly unanimously supported. And, you know, Councilor Houseman, I disagree with your suggestion essentially that everyone would be okay with paying more and in fact eager to pay more. I hear more concerns about cost of living and affordability than anything else. And I would suggest that taking such a broad statement about the financial situations of thousands of our constituents and residents is probably not appropriate for us to be doing. And this is going to increase costs. And whether some people are okay with that, I'm sure there might be, but this is going to impact a lot of people. That's all.
If I may just briefly respond, $12,000 amortized over a 30-year mortgage, it's not insignificant, but it is also typically not a deal breaker for people who are paying for housing in the price range that we are talking about. So I don't think I suggested that everyone would be more than happy to pay a lot of extra money for housing. If I did, perhaps I misspoke. Certainly, no one wants to pay more for housing. I think my general point is more to the fact that I think that coming generations are really looking for housing of this nature and with these kinds of amenities. Again, I mean, I think, you know, Governor Baker, when he set the wheels in motion on this to meet certain targets, understood the various push-pull and balancing tests, and at the end of the day, felt that it was important to move forward these. Counselor.
Sorry, may I
I'm
have a
sorry,
comment?
yes.
Sorry,
Mr.
yes,
Patel.
to your point, Councillor, about this not being a statewide mandate, this was actually originally designed to be an opt-in code. So I think it was intentionally designed for there to be 3 codes in the state of Massachusetts so that municipalities could have at least some choice, and that in the fact that it is an opt-in code, that there is at least a democratic process that's going into that. The reason why the base code still exists is that in most of these municipalities, they're mostly rural communities where there's not a lot of development going on, or the building inspector is shared across several municipalities, or there's just no interest in becoming a green community. So we've not gotten rid of the base code, and we're not going to mandate like either the stretch or the specialized energy code to be a statewide thing. This is both the stretch and the state and the specialized code are at the municipal level, because they're municipal, but the state codes that we would prefer to have at least some democratic input.
Counselor Bowen?
Thank you. It's great to hear the conversation and get a few more of the details, and I agree with Councillor Hausman. It's the right set of questions to be asking and trade-offs to be looking at. When I listen to the answers and listen to the experience of buildings that have gone up, I'm really encouraged that it's a good fit for Beverly. And I think, when we look at anything we want to opt into or not opt into, it really is looking at where are we positioned right now and where do we want to be positioned going forward. I think all evidence points to we are a desirable place to continue building, to continue retrofitting buildings, to continue redevelopment. As a council, we have largely tried to manage that so that we remain a desirable place for people to move to, and for people to develop, and for people to convert housing to the types of housing, size of housing, location of housing that people want now and that people will want in the coming decades. And I think we've had this discussion over a few different issues before about, if we impose some higher standards of whatever kind, like an inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires a percentage of multifamily housing to be affordable, like environmental standards, at what point will that potentially decrease the new supply in Beverly? And we have clearly not hit that point yet. And we clearly have developers who are ready to work here and who are ready to build what we in Beverly want and need. And I think my fear, if we don't take this opportunity to continue in the direction we've been going, reap the statewide incentives that are designed for communities just like us in the position we're already in, if we don't take advantage of that, I worry that new development may slip through the cracks, because it's true that everything is trending in this direction, and many homeowners, many builders are already choosing these strategies because the long-term payoff is there. We want to attract folks who are thinking in that way, not developers who are going to try and cut corners up front just to make a quick profit. So by adopting the code, we ensure that that's what we continue getting, rather than attracting just developers who are going to let things slip through the cracks. I think the protections for renters, as someone who's lived in multifamily housing for decades as a renter, any standard that helps with that day-to-day affordability is as important as, the factors that are increasing rents go beyond what's in the building or how it was built or when it was built. There are market forces even bigger than that this won't impact at all, but the day-to-day energy costs, the sort of health, air quality, all of these things, for me, are big benefits that vastly outweigh the initial costs, particularly given what we've heard about all the incentives in place that won't necessarily be in place forever. They're in place for the early adopters that we are well positioned to be without impacting development here in the form that we need it. So to me, I think I agree. We have to, every time something like this comes up, interrogate it in that way. And for me, this very much falls on it's the right time for Beverly. It safeguards some of the things that we've talked about wanting to safeguard. It gives us access to additional incentives to do things we already have planned and want to do more on. So while there is certainly some uncertainty still in the answers we're getting, they're very convincing to me.
Thank you. Do counselors have additional questions this evening? Counselor, go ahead. Counselor.
Just one, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so I understand, and I think I know the answer to this, but to confirm, we would more or less have to stay within the template of the proposed ordinance here, and that if the council wanted to carve out greater exemption for single-family or smaller multifamily than is prescribed in the proposal in front of us, we wouldn't qualify for the Climate Leaders Program, correct?
So that's correct, and there may be also other conflicts that might arise with the AGO, but I'm not certain about that. But what we have in our model language so far is that it is adopted as is, and we've not really have DOER at least has not entertained any changes to the specialized code.
Okay, so if we were like thinking of our affordable housing ordinance, it applies to buildings of 6 units or more. If we wanted to similarly style something of this spirit to that specifics, we wouldn't qualify because it would exclude a host of single-family and smaller multifamily units, correct?
That would be correct.
Okay, thank you.
We have more questions. Counselor Spang.
Mine is more of a procedural question for
Sure,
you.
sure.
And that is, are we going to have a time for public input? We've made some statements and thoughts about how the public would feel, but will we have a public forum or a time for people to tell us how they feel?
So this is an ordinance change, and I believe we would have to have a public hearing in order to adopt an ordinance change. But even if we didn't, if we weren't required, then we certainly, as a council, could choose to do that, and I think it would be appropriate. Councilor Bowen?
Thank you. And I think we can pass ordinance changes without public comment, but it does sound like inviting particularly folks who are involved in development, folks who are tenants and residents would benefit. So I'd certainly support that always. The only one point I wanted to make is, in terms of potentially exempting smaller single or small multifamily homes, I think that style of building is inherently less climate friendly. And so to me, it's a type of housing we need, and that it's even more important to ensure that building that already uses, more space for fewer people, that may be more car dependent, that we are ensuring that the same kinds of climate priorities are reflected in all styles of building, since we need that full mix. So to me, it's as important that it apply in that setting as well, and agree that the estimates, though they are more uncertain because there hasn't been as much fewer examples to draw from maybe in Beverly of specific buildings. The scale of the investments that we're talking about, also heard that described as a value add investment. So it's not like you put in that pre-wiring and then it disappears. Like, that's part of the value of your home if you go to sell it, or later on, you recoup what you're saving by not having to do it later, essentially. So it's not a cost, it's an investment that stays with the value of the home.
I do have a question in terms of other municipalities that have adopted this. So I think you said I think actually it's Councilor St. Hilaire, among the communities that have adopted this are Boston and Worcester, is that correct?
So there are 48 municipalities that have adopted it across the state. The map shows I love this map because it does show like a nice geographic distribution that's like not totally concentrated in the Boston metro area. as well as a diversity of urbanisms and, I guess, median wealth. So, as the councillor had mentioned, we have cities and towns like Worcester, Amherst. We have communities along the Cape and the islands. Salem and Swampscott are the closest to Beverly, and also a lot more rural. Both rural, suburban, and urban communities have adopted it. Among those, at least in the Northeast region that I know are considering it, I guess I can mention the ones that have had public forums. So Framingham is considering it. Hamilton is considering it. I've met with the Sudbury Environmental Committee, and I'm trying to, and the city of Andover, the town of Andover, and the town of Westford.
Okay. The reason I ask about Worcester and Boston, but this is actually helpful and sort of elaborates on the background of my question, which is sort of thinking about what Councilor St. Hilaire said about the cost to developers and the sort of the learning curve. So the infrastructure that is put in place can be viewed as heavy-handed, or it can be viewed as a benefit and an investment, a positive attribute to the property. But as to cost, it appears that more and more developers are not going to be finding this to be, new or unusual. Developers throughout at least our area, even if it's been adopted universally, certainly there's a density cluster in our area, in the greater Boston area, of developers who now know that this is the code they have to meet and are developing the expertise and the resources to do that. So I guess in terms of the developer community, I'm less concerned about the that aspect of the challenger the developer community might have than I am the question that seems to be on everyone's plate here, which is cost impact. And is the cost impact is it a burden or is it investment? Is doing it now a heavy lift that we should not engage in, or is it a look to the future as well as to the present, and saying that to Councilor Feldman's point, there are real benefits to being ahead of the curve, to Councilor Bowen's point as well on that score. And one of those distinct benefits really, I guess, is the taxpayer benefit to the municipal grant of $1 million plus technical technical amounts of $150,000 as well, which is a, if you will, indirect benefit to our constituents from a form of tax relief, if you will. So unless we have other questions or comments, because we have met this evening, for me at least, does not preclude having an additional meeting of legal affairs to spend more time. If councilors want to dig into this more, I am more than open to the question of having a continuing conversation. That was really the purpose behind leaving it, sort of a 2-month window here for us to think about this, to ask, good hard questions as we should be, try to get the answer to those, and have a chance for discussion. So we may revisit this again, and also for our colleagues who are unable to make it this evening. So with that, I would accept a motion to adjourn committee of the whole. Is there a second? All those in favor? Motion carries. And a motion to adjourn legal affairs. Second from here. All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for being here.